Hey everybody, Jen Hatmaker here, your host of the For the Love podcast. You guys, welcome to the show. Ooh, I got a hot one for you today. We're in a series right now called For the Love of What If. So what we're doing is asking ourselves, we're asking those what if questions. Like, let's dream about something differently that maybe at one time or another has maybe it's dogged our thoughts or held us back. But what if we didn't have to let fear or shame dictate what we pursue in life, what we do next, what we do with something we've already chosen? Or what if we did pursue a thing, it didn't work, it either failed or we failed it in some way possibly, and we decided, hey, instead of just letting that be an end of the road roadblock, what if I learned from it? So what if we have regrets about what we either did or didn't pursue and how it turned out, and we decided to make peace with those decisions and learn from them instead of buckle down in shame? If it was possible to do these things, how would we look at our lives differently? And frankly, how would we live our lives differently? I think it would really change us. And I think the idea of it makes me emotional because thinking about just shuttling our regrets around is so debilitating. And the opposite of what if we could engage in regret in a new way, and in a way that is going to inform the what ifs in our life. I'm going to give a quick little teaser here because my guest today literally said inside this interview, and we're about to talk about regret. He's the big four primary regrets. So really we all have it, and it is ubiquitous, and you'll hear about this. Revolve around this idea that we have, if only. If only I would have done this. If only I would have done that. If only I wouldn't have done this. So honestly, the way that we carry our regrets affects the way that we move through the world, because depending on how we look at them, which is what we're going to examine today, regrets can either weigh so heavy on us. I mean, they can take us right out of the game and really never have any sort of resolution. Or, according to my guest today, they don't have to. Because if we take the time to reframe this, to examine our regrets without judgment, they can and should become our teachers. They will show us what we value and the kind of life we're trying to reach for. And weirdly, regret is a gift. I know that might feel like a stretch right now. My guest book today is called The Power of Regret: How Looking Backward Moves Us Forward. So literally, this conversation belongs smack in the middle of this series. You guys, I am beyond thrilled to have writer and researcher Daniel H. Pink on the show today. Now, if you know Dan, I mean, you're just as thrilled as I am, because he's one of the most fascinating thinkers today, and generous. Dan is the author of 7 books, mostly on human behavior, 5 of them New York Times bestsellers. And he is just an absolutely interesting researcher and thinker. He reminds me of some of Brené's work in that she looks at the research and the data and then applies it to human emotion and then ultimately behavior, and carves out a path forward for us in such a way that is productive, healthy, healing. And so where Brené centers her work around vulnerability as a path forward, Daniel's work is centered around essentially the power of regret. And that is the name of his book, The Power of Regret: How Looking Backward Moves Us Forward. I realize this feels like a lot just to take on a regular old day in January. But this is a fascinating conversation. And I think it will give you permission, and I think it will give you relief, and I think it will give you comfort. Daniel is a fascinating guide. And what might feel kind of heavy for you as a listener at the beginning of this conversation, because regret is heavy and we have assigned a weight to it that we don't have to hang on to. There is a different way to perceive regret. So I hope you'll stick like beyond the initial discomfort into the like meat of this conversation, because I am just buzzing from it. So without further ado, here's my conversation with the brilliant writer and researcher, Daniel H. Pink. I am delighted to meet you. Daniel, thank you so much for being here, for being on the show. I'm telling you, I'm kind of on pins and needles to have this conversation with you and to hear everything that you have to say here. Your body of work is so interesting. So thanks for your time.
Well, thanks. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, okay, I've told my listeners who don't already know a little bit about you, but if before we sort of drill down into the power of regret, I'd like, if you don't mind, just for a minute, if you would tell us more, because you have put the most fascinating body of work into the world, including your past life as a chief speechwriter for Al Gore. I mean, you've got an interesting resume, sir, an interesting path, and it kind of is all over the place. And so can you tell us a little bit about you, kind of where you are in the world? Obviously, you are a writer, but kind of your path through these various genres and even whole careers, and kind of what brought you to where you are today.
So to make a very long story short, I grew up in Central Ohio. I went to college. I was always a pretty good student. I was also, middle-class kid on financial aid, so I wasn't going to do anything too crazy. So I went to law school. I decided I was really interested in politics at the time. So obviously law school is a pretty obvious path. I didn't really love it, knew I didn't want to be a lawyer. So upon graduating from law school, piled with debt, I started working in politics. I eventually became a speechwriter, not through any planning, but because at one point, some year, someone turned to me and said, "Hey, can you write a speech?" And I said, "Yep." And if I can just stop for a moment there and just double click on that, I actually think that's pretty good life advice. It's life advice that I've given to my own kid. So there are going to be points, especially for the young people who are listening, and even for the not so young people, there are going to be moments when someone's going to look around and say, "Can you?" Or someone's going to ask you, "Can you?" And the answer, your default answer to that question is yes. Say yes, and then figure it out.
So good.
And that was the case for me. So I became a speechwriter, realized I didn't want to work in politics, realized that at some level, after a few years of, very, very interesting jobs and working with people I really liked, I was always, quote unquote, writing on the side, writing articles, columns, things like that. And so in a completely squiggly, nonlinear way in my early 30s, I quit. My wife did not quit her job. She did not leave her salary. She did not leave her health insurance. I went up to the third floor of our little house in Washington, D.C., and said, "I'm going to take a couple of years and see if I can do my own writing." And that was 20 plus years ago. And, I wake up every day and try to make it work.
What was the first swing you took at your own writing?
At that point, the first big piece that I did there was I basically wrote about myself.
Sure. You're an expert on the subject.
What I ended up doing, and it ended up becoming my first book, is that I realized there were a lot of people like me who were leaving jobs or being forced out of jobs, and were going out on their own. This is in the fairly early days of the internet, and so I wrote a big story about that turned into my first book. And so, again, I'm always looking for, I mean, I don't want to be overly didactic to your listeners, but I do think that one can listen to the stories of other people, and if they have a little bit of mileage on them, as I do, they can stop and say, what are the lessons anybody can learn from this? And one of the lessons, if you'll indulge me here for a moment, is that I always said, in response to your question, I said, I think more than once, I was always, quote unquote, writing on the side. That is, I had other jobs, I had real jobs. But on the side, I was writing op-eds. I was writing columns. I was writing magazine articles. When I was in law school, I wrote many, many op-eds for the Hartford Courant. I probably wrote more op-eds for the Hartford Courant than I did law school papers, and and
Yeah.
and you know, and I think it's important to sort of as a way to understand ourselves is not to say, what's your passion, but to actually just say, what do you do? What do you do when nobody's watching? What do you do because
Good.
it's who you are? And
Mhm.
and it took me a while, Jen. It took me a while to
Mhm.
realize, like, hey, wait a second. I think I'm a writer. And
Yeah.
that's not something that I set out to do. If you had asked me when I was whatever 18 years old, oh,
Sure.
you're going to end up being a writer, I would say maybe, but probably not. It just sort of, it turns out that's what I did. That's who I was.
I love that answer. I think we would find our path a lot sooner if we asked that question, even of ourselves,
Absolutely.
that
I
we
agree.
find it sometimes a different answer than what it is we're doing 9 to 5 shows up.
Abs-
I,
Absolutely.
yeah,
I think it's a great point yeah, that you make. And I also think it's a way that we can provide a service to other people. That is
I like that.
one of the things that I find is useful to people in helping them is being actually less kind of directive than I have been being, in saying, here's the lesson to learn from that, but simply to look at people, listen to them and say, here's what I hear you saying, or here's what I see you doing, and reflect that
Mm,
back to them so they can
yeah.
draw their conclusions about what they do and who they are.
That's so great. I'm practicing that in real time right now with my young adult kids who are sorting this out really. Like, I've got this degree. Which parts of it do I love? Which parts am I discovering that I don't? And I think those are really like lovely questions to ask and of ourselves and the people that we love too. Sometimes other people see in me with crystal clear eyes what I cannot see in myself. And
Bingo.
so you make a great point. I'm
How old are your kids?
I've got 24, 22, 20, 19, 16. It's so many.
Okay, so we're similarly
Yeah.
situated, except that you have me. If we were play basketball,
Yeah.
you would have a 5-on-3
I
fast
got it.
break all the time.
Yeah. I don't even need to sub.
I would have to recruit some neighbors to get
Yeah.
to 5-on-5. But yeah, no, and again,
Yeah.
for people who are, I think it's important the stories that we tell our kids and the stories that we tell people that age. I think a lot
Mm,
of times people that age look at folks in their 40s or 50s
yeah.
and say, wow, that's really cool, that person is quote unquote successful, whatever the hell that means. But
Totally.
they think that person got there in this very smooth linear path, which is almost never it's never the case. It's
Yeah. It
very, very,
really
very rarely
isn't.
the case. It's usually back and forth, up and
So
down,
right.
and herky jerky. And the more they understand that, the more I think that they can realize, sort of figure out their
Totally.
path. And I think that those years, especially for kids who are college graduates, those years in the 20s, I mean, Meg Jay at UVA called it the defining decade. And I
Mm,
think that you can use that decade of your 20s. It's not, I don't mean the full 10 years, but that point in your life to ask some of these really important questions. Who am I? What do I do? What's my
mm.
contribution?
Oh, that is fantastic advice. And it feels like a relief. I think if that was the message sort of aimed at this age group, I think they would feel less of the crushing pressure that they feel to nail their path 1 minute out of school and know what they're doing and have it be this straight seamless thing, and it isn't. I love hearing you talk about that, and I'm really excited to hear you talk about the power of regret because first of all, I mean, kudos to you for like picking a topic and a word that is so supercharged. And I was thinking this morning, getting ready for this conversation, I don't know that I've ever heard anybody talk about regret in a positive light. It's a word that generally is attached to a negative connotation,
Yeah,
that we're
exactly.
almost not even allowed to have any. Like something we've misfired. If we have regret, then something we're doing it wrong. And so you say that regret is our most misunderstood emotion. So let's just maybe start there, with that foundational understanding of regret, and then we'll build on it from there.
Okay, so as exactly as you say, regret is an emotion. It's a feeling. It's the emotion we have when we look backward and say, if only I hadn't done that. If only I had done that. If only I had done that thing in a different way. So it is an emotion that arises when we think about the past, wish we had done things differently or done things in a different way, and it makes us feel bad.
Yeah.
Okay, that's essential here. Now, that's why we try to avoid it. But here's the dirty little secret. There are two dirty little secrets. One is that everybody has regrets. All right. So if you feel regret, it doesn't mean that you're flawed. It doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong. It means that you are a human being. In fact, what we know from a whole pile of research here, so there's 50 or 60 years of research in social psychology, in cognitive science, in neuroscience, in developmental psychology. What it tells us is that regret is one of the most common emotions that human beings have. It's arguably the most common negative emotion that human beings have. It is ubiquitous in the human experience. We have piles of evidence showing that regret is omnipresent in our lives. It is everywhere. In fact, it's so prevalent, Jen, that if you lack regrets, that's probably a sign of a problem.
Wow.
Here's why. Oh, yeah. So there are people who don't have regrets. 5-year-olds don't have regrets because their brains haven't developed. Regret is a very complicated, sophisticated kind of emotion. It involves traveling in time in your head, negating things that really happen, coming to the present. It's very difficult. 5-year-olds, we know from developmental psychology, don't have that capacity for counterfactual thinking. We don't have that until we're 7, maybe even 8. So 5-year-olds don't have regrets. People with certain kinds of brain damage don't have regret. So lesions in the orbital frontal cortex of their brain, certain kinds of Huntington's disease, certain kinds of Parkinson's disease, those folks sometimes don't have regret. Sociopaths don't have regret. So, but otherwise, if you're not 5 years old or have brain damage or a sociopath, you have regrets. Now, here's the weird thing about that. Okay. So remember, so it's everywhere, but it's unpleasant. Okay. I'm not trying to sugarcoat this. Regret stinks. I don't like experiencing regret. It makes me feel bad.
Yes.
So there's a puzzle here. There's a puzzle. The puzzle is this. Why would something that is unpleasant be so widespread? Why would all of us regularly have this sensation that makes us feel crappy? And the resolution to this riddle is actually relatively simple. Because it's useful if we treat it right, and we haven't been treating it right. So what we have, as you were hinting before, is we have some people who ignore their regrets. They feel that stab of negativity. They say blah 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 blah. No regrets, no regrets. I don't have any regrets. Da, 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 da. They're in denial. That's a bad idea.
Totally.
What's also a bad idea, what's arguably an even worse idea, is to wallow in your regrets. Ruminate on your regrets, get captured by your regrets. The better plan, which we know from 60 years of science, is if we confront our regrets, listen to our regrets, use them as data, as information, as feedback, and draw lessons from them. And when we do that, once again, we have evidence, especially from social psychology but other fields as well, that if you deal with your regrets properly, you can become a better negotiator. You can become a better problem solver. You can become a better strategist. You can find more meaning in life. You can become a clearer thinker. That actually processing our regrets in a healthy way is powerful. It is transformative. It can be an engine for learning and growth if we do it right.
That's so good. That's such a healthy lens. And when you say it like that, I go, yeah, this makes clear sense. And our instinct to resist and reject regret is against our better interests, obviously.
Well said. That's exactly right. That's a really good way to put it. I mean, it really is. That's exactly right. Our instincts, that's a great way to put it. I wish I had come up with that. Seriously, that our instincts of what to do are not in our best interest. Our instincts are wrong. Now, and this goes to some other, what we know about sort of instincts and intuition is sometimes it's right and sometimes it's wrong. And this is a case where our instincts are leading us away from our best interest. Brilliantly said. That's exactly what it was. And so what we have to do is we have to resist our instincts and think and listen to what the evidence tells us. And if we, and in a systematic way, if we look at our regrets here's the thing. We have this idea that saying I don't have any regrets is a sign of courage. That's not courage. Courage is looking your regrets in the eye and doing something about them. And
Right.
again, once again, we have, this is not some kind of exhortation. This is not me trying to pump people up. We have science on this. We have a half century of evidence showing that if we process our regrets in a systematic, intelligent way, don't ignore them, don't get wigged out by them, but listen to them, they can make us better.
It's so good. This reminds me of how a lot of us felt when we were first introduced to some of Brene Brown's work. And she was just simply urging us, based on nothing else than data and research, that vulnerability was the key. That was the path forward. And we just thought, well, that's the worst thing I ever heard. Because the discomfort is such a deterrent, as is regret. It's uncomfortable, and we're just, because we live these cushy Western lives, we get to not have discomfort if we don't want it. Like, we can opt out of some forms of discomfort because we're not survivalists. Something super popular to talk about this time of year is New Year's resolutions, of course, but I can tell you something. I've really never been a resolutions girl. I love them in theory, but in practice, it's just really never taken hold. It feels like a lot of pressure on top of already feeling a lot of pressure because life. So what I like to do is this. I think about areas of my life where I want to turn the dial just a little bit, like just adjust and recalibrate and set a small intention, maybe learn something new. Perhaps that's how you're exploring the new waters of 2023 too. If so, I'd love to invite you to check out my Me Course series. Me Course is my e-course series designed to help you show up better for yourself, for your family, and really everyone else. It's inspirational, it's educational, and it's actionable. Really, it is for all of us, and it's content that we can really use to create the change we want. I'm always joined by the most amazing category experts in everything from finance to wellness, faith, content creation, cooking, parenting, and more. Each Me Course is on demand with 4 15-minute-ish learning videos, along with digital resources, additional bonus videos, and so much more. Plus, you get access to our private community of learners. Explore more about each course and check out the incredible savings at mecourse.org. Happy New Year, everyone. Let's do this. If one of your New Year's intentions is to read more or to find more community in your life, I have just the thing for you. Jen Hatmaker Book Club. We are going on our 4th year of clubbing, and it is just one of my favorite things. We read the best books every month, thought-provoking, entertaining, fun, important, meaningful. I always love it when our members say they would never have discovered or read a book were it not for book club. But the real party is in our private Facebook community. People have made lifelong friends there, finding connections with other women literally right in their neighborhood and getting together with all of our local chapters. So when you're a member, you get so much fun stuff every month too. Of course, you get the book box with the book and a special gift and a love note from me, but you also get a whole bunch of digital resources like discussion guides, custom content, music playlists from our authors. That's one of our favorite things. I also host video podcasts with our authors from each month, as well as Facebook Live chats where you have a chance to get on Zoom with me for our month book talk. And you get special access to events, meetups. It's so fun. We are your people. Come join us. Use the code READ, R-E-A-D, for $5 off your first month at jenhatmakerbookclub.com. So it's interesting to steer into the research, and I want to ask you about that because you used the largest sampling of American attitudes on regret that's, I think, ever been conducted. And so that is, first of all, whoa. Second of all, I'd like to hear a couple of the more interesting or eye-opening things that you learned from that research that maybe were either surprising or really like some anchoring data for this whole body of work here.
Sure thing. Let me take a step back. So all the claims that I'm making here are rest on 3 legs.
Okay.
stand on three legs of a stool. One of them is again, research that other people have done. Again, we have scientists who have studied this emotion for a half century, and
Yeah.
they know a lot. They've told us a lot about how this emotion works. Second, as you mentioned, I did a very large public opinion survey, as you say, the largest public opinion survey of American attitudes about regret ever conducted. We working with a company called Qualtrics, we did a survey of 4,489 Americans, modeled the sample so that it represented the glorious diversity of the United States. That's number two. And number three, I also did another piece of independent research called the World Regret Survey, where we just simply have invited people around the world to submit a big regret.
That's
and
interesting.
there we have a database now of about 24,000 regrets from people in 109 countries. So I'm basing this on as you say, on evidence and on facts. Now, on the American Regret Project, that public opinion survey, there's it was a pretty complicated and expensive undertaking. And I did it such a large sample because I was looking for demographic differences. Do African Americans have different regrets than white Americans? Do women have different regrets than men? Do people with lots of formal education have different regrets than people with less formal education? And what I found is that there were not that many demographic differences.
That's interesting.
I know. It's basically so, but I'll give you the two most salient things that I found in that research. Number one is that I asked people a question, and I'm going to try to see if I can recreate the exact words, because the exact words are important. I said something like, how often do you look back on your life and wish you had done things differently? How often do you look back on your life and wish you had done things differently? Now, I'm describing regret, but not using the R word, because it is, as you put it a moment ago, it is so charged. Okay. I didn't want to get into this. There's this kind of no regrets fog machine out there. I wanted to bypass that. So I described the emotion without labeling it regret. And what we found in the sample of Americans is that 83% of people said they experienced this at least occasionally. Okay. That's so we have, I mean, essentially 7 out of 8 Americans experience this at least occasionally. The number of people when I didn't use the word regret, the number of people who said they never experienced this was 1%. Okay. Wow. So and then we had something like, I think it was like 12% said rarely. So we have that. So basically it's further confirmation that this emotion is ubiquitous. Now, demographic differences were not that great. Believe me. Wow. It's like there's this old line about you want to torture the data until it confesses. And I tried that. And
that's good.
And there were very few significant demographic differences. There were a few that was sort of mildly interesting, but not that big of a deal. But there was one demographic difference that I thought was fascinating and I think hugely important and probably relevant to your listeners. And it was this. When we think about the architecture of regret, or when we look at the architecture of regret, there are two, the broad architecture, okay? There are two kinds of regret broadly. Regrets of action. I regret what I did. And regrets of inaction. I regret what I didn't do. Exactly. I regret something that I did. I bullied somebody and I feel bad about that and I regret it. Or regrets about what I didn't do. I didn't start a business. I didn't ask Murray out on a date. Okay. So what we find is that when people there's a big age difference here. In our 20s, we tend to have equal numbers of regrets of action and inaction, equal numbers of regrets about what we did and what we didn't do. But as we age into our 30s already, but certainly 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, it's not even close. The inaction regrets outnumber the action regrets by a wide margin. Wow. 2 to 1, 3 to 1. Over time, what sticks with us are regrets about what we didn't do. Wow. We didn't reach out to that friend. We didn't ask that person out on a date. We didn't start a business. We didn't speak up. We didn't take that trip. That's what really, really sticks with us. And that to me was the two biggest findings from that American Regret Project were, one, the ubiquity of regret, and number two, the age effect on inaction regrets.
That's so interesting. Kind of as a leader of my community, I find myself immediately wanting to parse out that analysis into forward motion that these are the days of our lives. And I find that so fascinating and true. Like when you're saying it, I'm 48 and I'm thinking, I'm rolling through my Rolodex. I'm like, yep, yep, that all feels true. I'm curious, and if this is just, if you're like, look, I am a researcher, I am not a personal person to discuss this, but as you worked through this material, all the data, and then obviously like the writing project, did you sort of come face to face in a new way with a specific regret of your own?
Of course, yeah. I mean, my
And
regrets were an impetus for this whole project. I mean, the fact that I had, here's the thing. I mean, the reason I started working on this topic was because I had regrets of my own. And I was at a point in my life where, that some of us have, some of your listeners might have already reached. Some of them, I hope that you will reach it, because it is that you look up one day and realize that you have mileage on you. You realize that you have room to look back. You realize that you are no longer the youngest person in the room, but one of the oldest people in the room. You realize that 20 years ago, 25 years ago was a blink of an eye. And when you look back because you're a human being, you have regrets. There are things you wish you had done. There are things you wish you hadn't done. There are things you wish you had done differently. And it makes you feel bad. And I was at a point where I was reckoning with those. I wasn't tortured by them at all. I wasn't brought down by them, but I was bothered by them. And yet, again, exactly as you said at the beginning, Jen, I knew that nobody wanted to talk about regret. So it's like, okay, I'm not going to talk about this. But then, against my better judgment, I very sheepishly began talking about it with a few people. And I discovered that everybody wanted to talk about regrets. Once I mentioned mine, the floodgates opened and everybody wanted to talk about it. And, and that took me off on this journey. So I have a lot of regrets, not a huge number of regrets, but I have regrets about not being bold enough. I have a lot of regrets about, one of the biggest regrets I have is regrets about kindness. Where when I was younger, and when I was much younger, in this giant, just to give you some background, in this giant database of regrets that I have, there are a decent number of regrets that people have about bullying other people. I bullied somebody when I was in high school. I bullied somebody when I was in junior high, whatever. I wasn't that. That's not my regret. But I was in many situations when I was much younger, high school, college, even beyond, where I was in situations where people were simply not being treated right. They were not being treated fairly. They were being excluded. And I saw it. I knew it was wrong. And I didn't say anything or do anything. And that has bothered me for decades. And so the question then becomes, what do I do with that nasty feeling? I can say, it doesn't matter. Always be positive, never look back. That's a bad idea. I can say, oh my God, I am the worst person in the world. I am horrible. I'm just a worthless, wretched human being. That's a bad idea too. What I can do is say, wait a second, something that in this case, it was an inaction, something that I didn't do. What is it now? Like 30 years ago? Multiple times, 30 years ago. Still bugs me. It's like I've made so many decisions in the last week, most of which I don't remember. But there were decisions and indecisions and actions that happened 3 decades ago that not only I remember, but that bother me. That's a very strong signal. And it's a signal
that's good.
that gives me 2 pieces of data. One, it's a signal about what I value. Okay, this is really important. Regret clarifies what we value.
You're
and
right.
What that regret says to me is that I value kindness more than I might realize consciously, that I value kindness. Number 2, it instructs me. It instructs me on how to do better. And so I don't want that feeling again. And so if I process that feeling and draw a lesson from it, I say, you know what? I need to be more inclusive. I need to speak up if someone is not being treated right. If I see something wrong, I need to say something and not just passively let it go. And so that regret clarifies what I value and instructs me on how to do better. And that is one of the many things that regret does for us.
In addition to finding sort of the broad two categories, regret for action and regret for inaction, did you find any, like, as you drilled down a little bit into people's individual personal regrets, did you find as a handful or whatever of really common
Yeah,
regrets? What were
we
they?
did. We did. So in the World Regret Project, and forgive me for making this more confusing than it should be, but basically, so what we had is we had this public opinion survey. And then we also just had this thing, worldregretsurvey.com. You can find it online. You can go to our interactive map and see, what are the last 4 or 5 regrets from people in Oklahoma or in
Oh, yeah.
Argentina or whatever. And so what we found is around the world, people seem to have the same 4 core regrets. One was what I call foundation regrets. These are regrets that people have about small decisions early in life that accumulate to negative consequences later. I spent too much and saved too little. I didn't take care of my health. Now I'm woefully out of shape and unhealthy. Second one is boldness regrets. All right. You had a moment in your life where you could play it safe or take the chance. And when people don't take the chance, not all the time, but most of the time, they regret it. And this is about some of the things I mentioned before. It's lots of regrets about not starting businesses, not asking people out on a date, not speaking up, not trying stuff, not traveling, those kinds of things. So basically playing it safe when you could have been bold. Third category are moral regrets, which is where those bullying regrets come in. These are people who, again, were at a juncture in their life. They could do the right thing or they could do the wrong thing based on their own moral code. They do the wrong thing. They regret it. Not everybody, but almost everybody. So it's bullying, cheating, marital infidelity, lying, those kinds of things. And finally, number 4 are connection regrets, which are about relationships. And not only romantic relationships, in fact, mostly not romantic relationships. Most of the regrets about romantic relationships were about bad choices. Whereas the bigger category were these connection regrets, where basically people had a relationship that was intact or should have been intact. It comes apart, usually in undramatic ways. People want to reach out, but they say, oh, it's going to be really awkward if I reach out and the other side's not going to care. So they don't. And the drift widens, and then sometimes it's too late. And so what we got is we have, we can phrase all of these as if onlys, because that's the catchphrase of regret. Foundation regrets, if only I'd done the work. Boldness regrets, if only I'd taken the chance. Moral regrets, if only I'd done the right thing. And connection regrets, if only I'd reached out. And around the world, those seem to be the 4 most prevalent types of regret.
Wow. Those are so familiar. I mean, as you're saying, then I'm like, I have a pretty good finger on the pulse of just my community, which is just a little drop in the bucket in the world. But everything that you just said is something we have circled and circled and circled as a community, to resolve or confront or admit. There's a lot of shame baked into this conversation because we are ashamed of what we chose, whatever it was, whether it was action or inaction. And shame is just a deterrent. I mean, it is so uncomfortable. And so I like that your work probably, do you go on to parse out, like, here's how we sit in the pocket of these feelings. And here's, instead of just miring in shame, which is just, that's our first reach for most of these really big regrets. How do you instruct us to take a little bit more of a learner's approach to that discomfort? How can it be our teacher instead of just our ruler on the hand nun?
Tormentor. There are, well, I mean, we have research on this. That's the thing. It's like, we know how to do this, but just no one's ever taught us how. And so the way I like to look at it is a 3-part process that we can think of as inward, outward, forward. Okay. So you have to look inward. So inward is basically, how do we think about the regret and ourselves? This is the fundamentally, the most important step, which is that when we make mistakes, when we screw up, when we, blunder, the way that we talk to ourselves is ridiculous. It's harsh. It is brutal. And we And so what the science tells us is don't do that. In fact, that science comes from your neck of the woods, Jen. It comes from Kristen Neff at the University of Texas and her work on self-compassion. Absolutely. Some of the most important work that your listeners can encounter. And so basically what it says is that at first we should treat ourselves with kindness rather than contempt. Okay. So we should treat ourselves not better than anybody else, but not worse than anybody else. There's no evidence that lacerating self-criticism is effective. It's not. Second, what we should do is so this is the inward. What we should also do is recognize that we're not that special, that everybody has regrets, that regrets are regrets are part of the human condition. We tend to think somehow we're singular, that we're I might, and I did, when I think about the regret, the sort of what I always thought of, it's like, oh, this bizarre inaction kindness regret. It's so singular, it's so unique. Every time, I mentioned before, people, oh my God, that same thing with me. And it's like, so they're part of the human condition. And the other thing which I think is really important is recognizing that these mistakes, these mistakes, these screw ups, these regrets are a moment in our lives, not the full measure of our life. And once we do that, that opens the way for the outward. And the outward says it's actually important to talk about this stuff, to write about this stuff, to express it. It is an unburdening, as you mentioned. So when we talk about our regrets, it's an unburdening. We lift the weight. You mentioned the Brene stuff on vulnerability. One of the insights there is that we fear that when we are vulnerable, people will think less of us, when in fact they think more of us. And not every single time, but a lot of the time. Same thing is true with regrets. We think that revealing our regrets and our mistakes, people will think less of us. They actually think more of us. Not all the time, but a lot of the time, as I said. And then also the other thing is that talking about our regrets transforms them. Our emotions are vaporous. They're abstract. When we write about our negative emotions, talk about our negative emotions, we make them concrete, and that makes them less fearsome. So we've treated ourselves with kindness rather than contempt. We've written about them or talked about them. So one very specific thing you can do is write about your regret for 15 minutes a day for 3 days. That's it. Even that, there's some evidence that is actually an effective technique. And then finally, what we have to do is we have to draw a lesson from them. That's how we move forward. We can't just stop there. We have to say, what did I learn from this, and what does it teach me? And so, and to do that, it often is helpful to take a step back, do some self-distancing, and say, imagine if a friend of mine came to me with this regret, what would I tell him or her to do? And so we treat ourselves with kindness rather than contempt. We talk about it or write about it to defang it, and then we explicitly draw a lesson from it and apply that lesson going forward. And when we do that, regret is useful. It's a tool. It's not a burden.
Mm. That's so hopeful. That's so incredibly hopeful. And I'm thinking about how many people are just sitting in decades old regret, decades old. Like I like what you said earlier. Pay attention to what hangs on. It's a clue. That is a message telling us there is something here to address and deal with, and there's a way through it. We don't have to sit in the seat of shame and regret with absolutely no resolution or comfort or change at all. What's been the response to this book in the world? I'm very curious how your readers what are you hearing? You've got to feel thrilled about people breaking chains, essentially, that have kind of held them for however long of their lives.
Yeah, I mean, I've gotten some pretty incredible email from readers. Essentially, especially on these connection regrets, because one of the things about these listen, I've done it too. These connection regrets is that, let's say that I have an old friend named Bonnie. All right.
Bonnie. Okay.
Let's say I haven't talked to Bonnie for 10 years.
Okay.
And I think to myself, oh, I should really reach out to Bonnie. We were friends 10 years ago, but we haven't talked for a while. But it's so awkward because we haven't talked for 10 years. And besides, she's not going to care. So what happens? I don't do it. And then I wait 2 more years and I say, oh, I really should reach out to Bonnie. And I'm like, oh, no. Now it's been 12 years. It's even more awkward. And she's all right. That's a huge mistake. Basically, what the research, what this tells us is that if you're at a juncture where, at least for me, I'll give you the lesson I derive from this. If you're at a juncture and you're wondering, should I reach out or should I not reach out? Being at that juncture has answered the question. Always reach out.
That's good.
What the
That's great.
research tells us and what our lived experience tells us is that when we reach out, it's way, way, way less awkward than we think. It's often not awkward at all. Second, the other side almost always cares. They almost always welcome it.
Right.
And so what I have seen, this is a roundabout way to answer your simple question, which is that a lot of the emails that I've gotten from readers have been, I read this thing and I realized like I was really awkward about reaching out to John, who I haven't talked to for 8 years. And I reached out to him and we reconnected. I have so many emails like that. I did a TV interview about this literally last week where I don't want to say the person's name, but a pretty well-known TV personality, a very well, I think one of America's great broadcasters in my mind, told me that she had read the book and reached out to somebody. Okay. So I think that's one of the things. I think the other thing the other response that I'm getting is that people are realizing that they're not alone. They look at these regrets and, you know, we have all kinds, the book is filled with all kinds of regrets that people have that I've collected from all over the world. And they go, that's me. Yeah, I see myself in there. So they realize that they realize that they're not alone. So
that alone takes away some of the shame. A lot of these live in secrecy in our minds and hearts. And so thus it's very isolating. Just by virtue of keeping a lid on it and feeling kind of alone in a choice you made one way or another.
Absolutely. That's a great point too. And you use this word a couple of times, and I want to sort of go to it because I think it's so essential to all of this. So you use the word shame, and shame is very dangerous. Okay. Shame is insidious. It's not like regret, which can be hard, you know, that actually is sort of, you can actually approach in a way that is useful to you. Shame is different. To oversimplify just a bit, okay, we think about something like shame and something like guilt. All right, guilt is, and maybe my regret about kindness is about guilt. Right, guilt is I did a bad thing. Shame is I'm a bad person.
That's right.
And when we make those universal attributions about who we are, that is devastating. What we need to do on so many different levels in our lives is evaluate the act, not make universal attributions about the person. And shame is an attribution about the person. Shame is I'm a bad person. That's and when you're a bad person, you are irredeemable. When you've done a bad thing, there is redemption possible.
Oh, it's so important, that distinction. There's so much possibility on the other side of just using regret as a tool, as opposed to letting it metastasize as shame.
Yes.
That is so corrosive and so hard to recover from.
That's a good metaphor for that, because it sits and the cells multiply.
That's right.
And it starts eating away.
This is amazing. I just absolutely commend you for tackling a subject that is, I mean, that's not what we all like. What do we want to talk about, guys, around the dinner table? Let's talk about regrets. Like, you picked it. You picked a big one. And yet there's so much like possibility and comfort and hope baked into your work. And so I'm just thrilled. I know.
Well, don't underestimate how much people do want to talk about this. I'll give you again another reader feedback.
You're right.
Is that I have, especially, it's weird. I wasn't expect this from businesses, from like business leaders, bosses, essentially, who's saying, hey, you know what? I read this. I was pretty skeptical of this whole regret thing. It's like, I don't want to deal with this. And yet I read it and I was sort of convinced. And so in my next, I had a meeting with my team, and I told them about a regret that I had, and I told them what I learned from it. And I told them how it instructed me to do better. And we ended up with the most useful conversation we've had in my company in the last 12 years.
I love this.
So people people are willing to, you have to talk about it the right way. What you have to do is you have to, and we can do that. You can do it around the dinner table. You can do it around in a meeting. You say, here's a regret that I have. Here's what I learned from it. And here's what I'm going to do about it.
Yeah.
If you just say, here's a regret that I have, isn't that awful? Aren't I terrible? That's not very useful.
Totally.
if,
Yes.
if you say, here's a regret that I have, here's what I learned from it, and here's what I'm going to do about it, it's very helpful. And even with our even parents,
Mm,
kids can learn a lot from their parents' honest reckonings with their own
it's
shortcomings
good.
and their own mistakes.
Um,
Yeah.
okay, fantastic. I have one last question for you, and this is
Yes,
just
sir.
everybody in the show gets this question, and I would
Uh-oh.
love for you to answer it however you want to answer it. The answers run the gamut from like earnest to absurd, and everything in between, and we love them all. So, it's however you feel today.
I do
Um,
I do absurd better than earnest, but let's see.
Great. So do I. I borrowed this question from another writer and Episcopal priest, and I love her work. This is her question. What is saving your life right now?
Knowing that I'm going to give an earnest answer. I'm sorry.
Okay. Nope. We like
There
them.
are, but I wanted to give the first answer that came to mind.
Yes.
Knowing that there are people in my life whom I love and who love me.
Oh, isn't it? It's everything, right? It's just
Yep.
everything. It's really what it all kind of boils down to.
Yep.
Um, Perfect. I am absolutely delighted to have met you. And I'm so grateful, Dan, for your time and your expertise and your just open heart toward this conversation. I'm excited. I'm about to go try this out. I have a thing later today. I'm going to try this. I'm going to see how it works. I'm going to let you know because I've got your cell number.
Lay it on me.
And
Yeah.
so,
No, let me know how it goes. Let me
yeah,
know how it
that's right.
goes. I mean,
That's
here's the
right.
thing. It's like I should probably put a disclaimer, like your mileage may vary, but seriously, this, let's, there are other, a lot of times I think we labor under the belief that we are somehow vastly different from other people.
Yep.
And we're not.
We're not.
We're not. We're
I
just like
know. What a
everybody else. And
comfort.
so if if someone came to you and shared a regret, you would likely, I don't mean you,
Say
Jen,
one of
but just
mine.
came to us.
Yep.
If someone came to us with a regret and said, hey, here's a regret that I have, here's what I learned from it, here's what I'm going to do about it, 99% of us wouldn't say, oh, you loser, what's wrong
Never.
with you? We
That's
would
right.
say, wow, okay, I admire that. I admire that
Totally.
courage. I admire that keenness of mind. I
Yes.
admire your being a role model for how we deal with negative emotions. And so,
That's right.
so if we, so again, there's an old journalistic adage. I heard this years and years ago. It's like always extrapolate from your own experience. You're not that
That's good.
special.
Like it sounds mean, except it's actually comforting. Like,
it
look,
is.
you're just a normal person having a normal human experience, like a normal
Bingo.
adult. That's what it is.
Bingo.
Welcome to the
Bingo.
human experience. Yes.
Amen.
So great. Okay. Well, I'll have links to all your everything up for my listeners so they can find out more because there's a lot. We just scratched the surface. There's so much under all this to learn from and to process. And so, hey, thank you for coming on today. If you're ever in Austin, Texas, dinner on me.
Fantastic.
Yes.
I love dinner.
Yes. Write it down. Okay.
Barbecue.
Thanks, Dan.
All righty. Thanks, Jen. Thanks for having me. Take care. Bye.
Okay, you guys, incredible conversation and so interesting. And when I tell you, we've barely scratched, like there's so much underneath it, just practical, tactile elements of this conversation and then what to do with it. And so if you go to jenhatmaker.com under the podcast tab, I will have this entire interview. I'll have all the show notes, all the stuff, all the links, and I'll put up all of Dan's stuff. His books, his website, anything that you are more interested in learning about, I will put that into your hands because I think this has the power to change our lives. Don't you? Really change our lives, literally. When he named those 4 categories of regret that are ubiquitous to the human experience, I'm like, yep. If we learned from those and retooled our forward motion from those if onlys to what now, it's fascinating. Anyway, I'm so glad you're here. I think this entire series is like this. It is for me, just impetus for like excitement and possibility and growth and I love it. It's really like captured my imagination, and I hope it has yours too. So come back next week, and we've got absolutely more to come. All right, you guys, on behalf of Laura and her crew and Amanda and I, we love you, and see you next week.